you all doing? I hope you're all well, enjoying the hot weather that we're finally getting in the UK. This is just going to be a CB chat type video. I haven't done one of these for a while, and a few people, I think 3 people, have sort of said, Fred, you know, would you do another chat video, mainly about the CB back in the old days when we all got started. I came on in 1982, so I said, yeah, I don't mind, I'll do one of these. So I'm not going to be reviewing anything. I'm not even going to be going on the radio, so I do apologise if you've come. I know this is Fred 2, but if you've come here expecting me to do a contact on the radio, a little QSO or something, sorry, it's not going to happen. Just me chatting, just going to be chatting. So it's a good time now. Maybe get yourself a cup of tea, get yourself a cup of coffee, get yourself a beer, roll up a cigarette, get your vape tank filled up or whatever, and not much going to be going on. I'll put some pictures up as I go along, possibly, just to let you know what I'm talking about, but you can just put it on headphones and it will work just as well. So yeah, I mean, CB back in the old days. Now, I've explained before, I was at an age where I came on in 1982, which was pretty much about the time of the explosion of CB that hit the UK, certainly hit my town in the UK, in Hertfordshire. And I think pretty much, from what I gathered, you know, all the areas, all around your areas are pretty much going to be the same sort of thing. And in a nutshell, we spoke about it before, CB kind of exploded in the UK. We had a couple of very, very active years when it was licensed, and generally people took it relatively seriously to a point. And then after that, it all just went downhill very, very quickly. Swearing, kids got hold of the radios and obviously just used it for abuse, really. And so this story is a little bit about that, about one individual that went down that road and what happened to him. He trod on the wrong type of toes, and it wasn't disastrous what happened to him, but I think it probably shook him up. Well, what you have to remember is, on CB radio, there was a pecking order, very much like there is in anything, like school, work, prison. Not that I've been to prison, but you get the idea. So there was a pecking order. So you had your grown-ups, people that were sensible-ish, probably in their late 20s, 30s, might have had kids, and they only really came on a CB in the evenings because they were working. And in our sort of town, they tended to go on mainly on the 1-9, or they had their own channel that they would all meet up on. They very seldom came down to the 1-4 because the 1-4 was a bit of a zoo, and that was where us kids, teenage kids, hung out on the 1-4. That was the 1-4 was the calling channel for home base. The 1-9 was more for mobile stations. As a home-based station, as a 15-year-old kid, if you kind of got found out calling out on the 1-9 and you sort of weren't mobile, the contact didn't last very long. People didn't want to speak to you on the 1-9. We respected that. We had the 1-4. So you had the grown-ups on the 1-9 and their own little channels, their own little groups, and then you had the sort of elite teenagers, if you like. These were probably 17 to 19-year-olds, the ones that had cars, because as I've spoke about before, back in the mid-80s, early 80s, you were nothing unless you had a car. If you had a car, you had your chance of getting a girlfriend or taking a girl out was astronomically greater than if you had a push bike like I had. Girls just wanted guys with cars to get out of the town, go to cinemas, pubs, like that. So then you had that. So you had that group, and then below it you had sort of everything else, and that was really us with sort of teenagers. Now, you got to bear in mind, CB radios, they weren't exactly cheap when they came out. I mean, when I got my first radio, my first Harvard, it was about 50 quid, £50, and that was an entry-level CB. So they generally went from about £45 up to probably 120 or something, and that included the home base radios, a bit like that Murphy up there, or I think it was the Fidelity, the 3000 radio. I can't remember the models, but also, you know, the Binatone 5-star, which had the old fancy Delta tune. Some of the Uniden radios, the Midland radio, they were over £100, sort of £100 to say 140 in some cases. And I'd have to run it through the Google sort of calculator, but it seemed quite a lot of money. I mean, as a school kid trying to get a £50 rig and an associated antenna, that was enough And anyway, so yeah, that was sort of your pecking order. Sound down on the TV, and I'd have a CB on in the background, and I'd be flicking around the channels, just sort of earwigging these older boys, because that's what I wanted to be. That's what I wanted. I wanted to inspire to be one of these guys that were going out with girls and had cars, and were talking about cars and putting cherry bombs on their Mark 1s and Mark 2 escorts and things like that. You know, when you're like 15 years old, you really want to be 17, and that's the thing, because I've said it before, and I was quite honest about it. When I came on to CB radio at 15, it was all about initially meeting girls, having been able to chat to girls on the radio, and I was so surprised that these girls that would totally ignore you at school or at the local youth club on radio, because they couldn't see you, I guess, and there was the safety of the radio aspect. You could have quite deep conversations with these girls, find out about their hobbies, their interests, things like that. It'd be quite open on the radio, and it was a real eye-opener, you know, to be able to talk to girls in such a fashion, something you sort of couldn't do at school. And of course, you would listen to the older lads that would go out, and they would do the eyeballs as well, and the fox hunts, which we have talked about before. So if you don't know what it were, the fox hunts was one of these guys would go out in his car. He would reduce power, or sometimes they had a sort of small, slight dummy type antenna, and he would park up somewhere. It wouldn't be that remote. It might be around the back of a industrial estate in a car park or something. And all the other guys would drive around in their cars, and they would be talking to him. And the ones that had an RF gain on their control, they'd be gradually turning their RF gain down and down and down, homing in, till they found him. He was the fox, and then they would find him. It would take maybe an hour sometimes, maybe a bit longer. We as lads would be sitting at home listening to this on our CB radio, really kind of exciting, wishing that we was involved in it. And they would find the fox, and then they would all get together, and then they would go to the pub and have a few sort of drinks. So this would normally start at one of the eyeballs, where they'd all kind of get together in their cars in a car park and decide who was going to be the fox. And you had groups of girls that would turn up, normally in pairs or in threes. Girls never went anywhere on their own, did they? And they would sort of turn up, and they would try and hitch lifts in these guys' cars and join in the chase of sort of the fox hunt, and then hopefully they would get the guys to take these girls. They were sort of 15 to 17 years old, something like that, and they would get these guys to take them to the pub, and whereupon they would fleece these guys for as many drinks as possible. And as a guy, of course, it didn't really matter so much what you looked like. Even if you had your mum's Mini, if you had a car, you would get a couple of these girls. Oh, come on, give us a lift in your car. Come on, give us a lift in your car. Yes, come on, let's do the fox hunt. So this poor dweeb of a guy, this guy, he was generally taken for a ride, and he kind of knew it, but he would get two of these girls in the back of his mum's Mini or whatever, and him and his mate, so there's four of them, and they'd fly all around using up all of his petrol. They'd find the fox, and then the guy would basically try and do everything in his power so that he had the girl on her own in the car when he dropped her off, because what he wanted, the whole thing, the whole day was all kind of focused down to one moment, and that would be that when he dropped the girl off at her home, that he might be able to give her a little bit of a kiss goodnight, a little bit of a snog, and if he was really lucky, he might be able to slide his hand up her jumper and cop a feel before she sort of pushed him off and sort of turned around. What kind of a girl do you think I am? Do you think I'm like that? I mean, some guys got lucky. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm sure some guys got dead lucky, but they were probably generally the sort of attractive, confident guys that got lucky all the time. Most of the guys that went on these sort of fox hunts were the sort of spotty, skinny kind of lads that needed a bit of a hand, you know. But the funny thing was, and I know looking back, as an aged grown-up now, I imagine that's probably mostly what happened. That's probably the best thing they got was a little snog, and they copped a feel, and maybe they got the girl's phone number if they were lucky. But of course, when these lads went sort of back on a CB radio, sometimes the same night or the next night, and I would be earwig, you know, typical lads over I'm sure this is the same thing over the country, over the world. They were boast like mad. So of course, you know, the story they would tell on the radio was the fact they'd dropped this girl off and they literally were fighting her off. She was almost raping them in the car, and they had to sort of be very gallant and kind of, you know, pushed her off and like, I don't do that sort of thing on first dates, love, you know, maybe after we had a couple of dates we'd do that sort of thing, but you know, who do you think you are? Do you know what I mean? They were like, they'd all be really gallant about these supposed kind of relationships that happened in that, and it may have happened every now and then, but that's what it was about. So it was about girls, about these guys getting girls, and about us listening to it, wishing that we were the guys getting the girls. Anyway, waffling on as usual, but so move forward. 1983 was sort of CB had been around. It'd been around just over. Started October '81, so it was only about 18 months, getting on for 2 years. But it was already starting to change. The prices of radios had come down. They weren't dead cheap yet. They did become very, very cheap, but they weren't dead cheap. But generally, things had settled down. The prices had come down, and some of the parents, if you like, that had bought the radios thinking it was going to be the next best thing, they'd got a bit bored of it by then. So you did start getting 1 or 2 younger teenagers come onto the air, and by and large at first they were okay, but obviously being sort of 13, 14-year-olds, they were, you know, they want to come on sometimes and be a little bit argumentative and tell you every new swear word that they'd learnt in the playground that afternoon, things like that. And there was one such guy, and unfortunately I helped him come back on air, because at first I thought he was going to be okay. I'll call him Andy. His name wasn't Andy, but I'll just do that anyway. So this person came on the air, this Andy. He didn't sound that young. He obviously a kid, but so was I, but he didn't sound that young. But from where I sort of was, I was at my parents' place, and my antenna wasn't very, very high. My dad totally refused to allow me to attach it to the side of the house, because back in those days, if, for example, the only way you could get an antenna fitted professionally was normally TV sort of repairmen or TV guys that did TV installations, things like that, and they would only fit a legal antenna. So if everyone wanted was a GPA or a silver rod, which was an 18-foot 5/8 wave or half wave antenna, that was the cheapest antenna. It still is. I mean, the silver rod is still probably one of the best antennas you can get for the money. It works really, really well, and that's what you wanted. But they were illegal because the UK had this stupid damn restriction that if this was your transmitting part of your antenna, it could only, I think it was 1.5 meters high. You couldn't have it more than 1.5 meters high, and you could only have it so far on a pole, so far above the gutter line or something. It was just created to limit how far you could get out, but professional installers would only fit legal antennas, which were more expensive than the GPAs, and they weren't as efficient. They didn't work as well. So getting an antenna fitted, if you couldn't do it yourself, was quite difficult. And this lad came on, this Andy, and as I say, I could get out maybe not far, 2 or 3 miles. Really, but that's all you needed. There were so many people on. Well, he came on, and he was giving me literally about 1 or 2 pound of signal. We didn't have the noise factor in those days. I mean, nowadays we'll get 6 or 7 pounds of noise. There was very little noise. We created the noise, and other people moaned about it. You quite often only get 1 or 2 pound of noise, and he was in my noise level, so I thought he was quite far away. And then when I spoke to him, it turned out that he was less than half a mile away, and he had a GPA 18-foot antenna, and I couldn't understand why his signal was so low. He had one of those sort of triangular home-based radios. I think they were made by Fidelity. I'll try and find a picture. They were the ones that looked like a sort of clock radio. So his parents had obviously spoilt him a little bit and bought a GPA, bought this home-based, but it was terrible. I couldn't make out why his signal was so bad. So me and my mate Terry on the radio, we decided that we'd go round and see if we could help him out, because, you know, that's sort of what you did back in those days, and still today people will do it. We turned up at Andy's house, and what happened was that his dad had tried to fit the antenna, and I know it sounds really crazy, but what he'd done, his dad had taped it with sort of gaffer tape. He'd taped it to a drain pipe, so you had a plastic drain pipe about 2 inches off the wall, and then you had the GPA just taped to it. So of course he was getting nowhere, because I mean his SWR would have been off the scale, and most of his signal was hitting the wall and just wiping itself out. So what we did, me and Terry, with the permission of his mum, and she wasn't very happy about it, but Andy, he was a spoilt little kid really. We took this GPA silver rod, if you like, we took it off the drain pipe, and where you have like the little U bracket at the bottom, we was able to screw it to the side of his dad's garage. His dad had a separate garage, like a brick built garage with wooden weatherboards, and we just sort of like screwed it to the side of that. It was quite low off the ground, but of course we was able to adjust the top, I think it was the top section we adjusted, and we got the SWR below 2, and thankfully he had enough RG58. Again, that was another thing, his dad had just coiled all this RG58 up and slung it in his bedroom, so we stretched that out, and yeah, we helped him out. And then we sort of went back, gave him a radio report, and I think I was getting a good S8 to S9 signal from him, which is what I should have got in the first place. And you know, me and Terry, we thought we'd done him a favour. He was now getting out with a good signal, we could talk to people, but it very quickly went wrong, and we regretted setting that antenna up. And what happened was, this guy, I say he was only 13, he was quite short as well, so he was a young looking 13, he looked like a little kid, which is what he was, and he started attending these eyeballs, which I've said before, you know, you went to the eyeball, they weren't massive, but you had quite a lot of girls there hoping to get lifts in these cars. And he went along, and of course once they realised who he was and the fact that he was a kid, they weren't that interested in him. He was only 13, they were like 16, 17, some of them. They weren't interested in a little kid, he was like an annoying little brother. So after that, things changed on the radio for him, because when he would sort of come on all kind of bolshy and sort of try and chat these girls up, of course they knew he was a little kid and they didn't appreciate it, and they sort of closed him down very quickly. And he got the ump about it. He really started to get the ump about it, and very quickly, when they started rejecting his advances, he then started getting nasty, and he would be insulting, and yeah, he was just being a right little arsehole to these girls. And what he did, these girls, they all got together and pretty much sent him to Coventry. They said, you know, not going to talk to him. So as soon as he came on, oh it's Andy, or whatever, I can't remember his call sign, I can't remember it, but as soon as he came on, they totally ignored him, and that got him even more angry, being ignored. I mean, I think it's only child syndrome, he was obviously quite spoilt, and this got him really annoyed, and then he would sort of get quite angry, and this backlash of being rejected by these older girls, which was pretty obvious that was going to happen, it kind of came back on us, because then when we would be talking to these girls, trying to shut up the girls, hi ladies, it's Fred in the Shed on the CB radio, when we were chatting up the girls, to little success, but we were trying, he would then start keying over us, and it started off with a dead key. So I would get an S9 now, key up, a dead key, wiping out work. He then started keying up with playing heavy metal music, so it was like Metallica, AC/DC, really this really heavy metal music, and it became really annoying, and it got to the stage where you'd switch on the radio and you'd flick round, and almost on one channel all you'd hear is an F8, F9 signal of this little shit just keying over people, and I knew straight away that if I was going to speak to any of these girls, I was going to get keyed over. But he probably would have even got away with that, because we were kids and we were quite forgiving. But it moved on from there, because he then maybe got bored of messing about with us, and he went on to the sort of elite, if you like, the guys that were on from sort of 7 o'clock towards into the evening, and he started keying over them. And this wasn't a good thing to do. This really wasn't a good thing to do. I'd had some dealings with these older guys. I'll make a separate video on this at some point, but it was a misunderstanding. They thought I was being abusive, and it wasn't me, but it resulted in them putting a pin or a needle through my coax, and when that didn't work, coming round one night and threatening to beat my head, you know, kick my head in really, and it wasn't me, it was a misunderstanding, and thankfully I didn't get hurt. But I was quite wary of these teenage guys. They were all kind of pumped up on testosterone, showing off to the girls. Quite often they'd have a few drinks as well, driving around in their cars, and yeah, you know, but Andy just didn't seem to sort of care. He went straight after these guys, keying all over them. Thought it was really funny when he would de-key, and of course they'd fly back with loads of insults and threatening to do all sorts of things to his genitalia, and he would be, yeah, he'd think it's quite funny, and he'd be like laughing at him, and then he'd sort of key up again, because basically he was a kid. And they were keen to find out who he was, and then someone mentioned, oh yeah, well, Fred set him up. Fred set up his antenna. Great. So they knew who I was because they'd already threatened to kill me. And very quickly they sort of come round. They wanted to have a chat. not what I wanted to do. So of course, naturally, I grassed him up straight away. I said, yeah, look. Me and Terry, yeah, we did set him up. I know we set him up. We didn't know he was going to be such a little shit. You know, don't condone anything that he does. But they were like, well, how old is he? And I said, well, he's just a kid. He's just 13 years old. And they were like, oh, they thought he was older. So they sort of realised that there was some honour amongst teenagers in those days. I mean, nowadays, yeah, I could quite believe 17-year-olds would go after a 13-year-old that was being annoying on social media and, yeah, kick the crap out of him, or worse. I mean, you see things on the radio now, or on the TV, I should say, it's awful. But in those days, they knew that they couldn't beat up a 13-year-old kid because they probably had younger brothers. But they decided they wanted to take his setup down. They wanted to destroy his antenna. And because I set it up, they wanted me to go along with them because somehow they felt I was responsible for setting him up. When they cut his coax or they ripped his antenna down or whatever they were going to do, I didn't want to get involved in that because you know, breaking into someone's back garden, you know, it's not good, is it? It's not something I wanted to do. So I wouldn't go. I said no, I'm not going to do that. But I'll tell you where he lives, and I explained how me and Terry had screwed the antenna onto the side of the garage, and we explained that the coax was quite tall from the garage to his bedroom window. So I didn't think there would be, unless they had a long pair of secateurs or something, I didn't think they'd be able to cut it. But I was quite happy to be a supergrass. I was scared of these guys, I really was. 15 years old, yeah. Anyway, what they did, so one night they all went round there. Imagine they'd probably had a few drinks, climbed over his back gate into his parents' garden, and as I suspected, the antenna, the RG58 was too high that they couldn't. I don't know if they took wire cutters, but they couldn't reach up to cut it. So they ended up, I don't know if they slung something over the coax or whatever, they ended up trying to pull the RG58 out of the back of the antenna. But that's not what happened. They pulled on this, and where me and Terry had securely sort of screwed it into the weatherboarding, the wooden weatherboarding on the garage. What happened was this massive, like 8-foot strip of weatherboarding, which is about sort of 2 inches thick, came ripping off the garage, ripped off and coming crashing down into his mum and dad's garage, and then the antenna then went whipping across into his neighbour's garden, and they think, well, I heard that it sort of smashed into their greenhouse. So an 18-foot length of aluminium or aluminium pole. So they legged it, of course. All the lights sort of came on. They legged it, got back into their cars, and they went legged it. But the upshot was that they never got in any trouble with the police. But it obviously traumatised Andy's parents. I mean, you can imagine someone doing that amount of sort of damage, and they had to repair the garage. So the upshot was that Andy was never allowed back on radio. They never put that antenna back up. That was a good, wise choice, and thankfully that was the last we heard of him. But he was sort of one of the first of the new generation that was going to come on and cause trouble. We didn't realise it at the time, but we had a lot more like him come on, and in the end they just completely sort of took over, really, and sort of ruined it. Andy himself, I never really saw much of him. A few years later he did get a car. I do seem to recall he had a weird car for the time. He had a Vauxhall Chevette Saloon that he was hacking about in, still playing his heavy metal Metallica AC/DC music. He was blasting around town in that, and that's sort of the last I saw of him. But that was what it was like on radio. You did have to be a bit careful. People did get overconfident sometimes on air because they thought they were safe, if you like. and they would start being quite abusive, and the guys wouldn't stand it, especially if he was abusive to the girls. You know, their testosterone was high, and their camaraderie between guys. You shouldn't abuse even if they weren't their girlfriends, you shouldn't abuse girls, which you shouldn't really, but you had to be a little bit careful. So yeah, that was it. That was the story of Andy getting his antenna ripped down, and yeah, me nearly getting involved, but thankfully I didn't get involved. Yeah, the story about my antenna getting pinned and almost getting killed, I'll save that for another video. Just that happened so quick as well. That things went wrong very, very quickly. Never. What I shall say is, like, when never walk out the room and leave your CB radio plugged on when you've got arseholes of mates sitting in your room. That's what I think. But anyway, that's about it. It's a big waffle on. I don't know. It might be half hour long, whatever it is. If you stuck it through it to the end, which I know one or two of you might have done, thanks for that. Cheers. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you're all staying safe. We're still in this dodgy times, aren't we? All these new variants of COVID in the UK. When's it going to end? My God, when is it going to end? But hopefully it will. It will end soon. Enjoy the sunshine while it's there. Enjoy the skip while it's there. Please stay safe. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you on the next one. Cheers, guys.